In the quiet town of Millbrook, an old murder case has lingered unsolved for 37 years. The locals still whisper about the Thornfield family and their strange habits. Behind the tall hedges of their Victorian home, they practiced secret rituals that were meant to bind them together forever. The townspeople heard chanting on moonless nights and saw flickering candles in the attic windows. Then one October evening in 1987, it all ended in blood. Sarah Thornfield was found dead in the basement, surrounded by symbols carved into the wooden floor. Her family claimed it was an accident during one of their ceremonies. The police had their doubts, but the evidence was too thin. Now new findings have emerged that change everything. The truth about what really happened that night is more shocking than anyone imagined. But what secret was worth killing for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, cutting through the silence of Ray Morrison's retirement like a blade through fabric. He'd been up for an hour already, nursing his second cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint his backyard fence in shades of gold. At 65, Morrison had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of his days, the gentle predictability of a life no longer governed by crime scenes and witness statements. "Morrison," he answered, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of 4 decades spent asking hard questions. "Detective Morrison, this is Sarah Chen with the Millbrook Police Department. I'm calling about the Thornfield case." The name hit him like a physical blow. Morrison set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, watching the dark liquid ripple from the tremor in his hand. 37 years. 37 years since he'd walked into that basement and felt the world tilt sideways beneath his feet. "What about it?" he managed. "Sir, we've found something. Something that changes everything." Morrison closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 28 again, standing in the doorway of 1247 Elm Street on a cold October morning in 1987. The Thornfield house had loomed before him like something from a Gothic novel. All weathered shingles and twisted iron railings. Fog had clung to the Victorians' peaked rooftops, and every window seemed to watch him with the hollow stare of the long dead. He'd been the junior detective then, eager to prove himself, hungry for the kind of case that would make his reputation. Linda Hayes, his partner, had warned him on the drive over. "These aren't regular folks, Ray. The Thornfields have been in Millbrook since before the town was incorporated. They've got history here, and history has weight." But Morrison had been young and confident, certain that evidence and logic could unravel any mystery. He'd walked up that cobblestone path with his notebook ready and his questions sharp, never imagining that this case would follow him for the rest of his career like a shadow he couldn't shake. The front door had opened before he could knock. Edmund Thornfield stood there, tall and gaunt, with silver hair that caught the morning light like spun metal. His eyes were the color of winter storms, and when he smiled, it never quite reached them. "Detective Morrison, I presume. We've been expecting you. That should have been the first red flag." The call had come in less than 2 hours ago. How had they been expecting him? Inside, the house felt older than its century and a half of existence. The wallpaper was deep burgundy with patterns that seemed to shift when Morrison looked at them directly. Heavy drapery blocked most of the natural light, and candles flickered in brass holders throughout the rooms. The air smelled of old wood, burning wax, and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made his stomach turn. Constance Thornfield sat in a high-backed chair in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, with the stillness of carved marble. She wore black, which Morrison initially attributed to mourning, but later realized was simply her preferred color. Her hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, and her lips barely moved when she spoke. "Our Sarah has passed on," she'd said, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she were commenting on the weather. It was her time to join the deeper mysteries. The children clustered around her like satellites around a dark planet. Marcus, 19 and already showing signs of the gauntness that marked his father, stared at Morrison with undisguised suspicion. Lydia, 16, kept her eyes downcast, her fingers working at the hem of her black dress with nervous energy. Thomas, the youngest at 14, seemed to be fighting back tears that his parents clearly would not approve of. "Tell me what happened," Morrison had said. Pulling out his notebook, Edmund stepped forward, his presence filling the room like smoke. "Sarah was participating in one of our family observances, an ancient tradition passed down through generations of Thornfields. Sometimes, Detective, the veil between worlds grows thin, and those who seek to cross it must accept the consequences." Morrison had heard a lot of explanations for death in his 8 years on the force, but this was a first. "I'm going to need something more specific than that, Mr. Thornfield." Of course, Edmund's smile was patient, condescending. "Sarah was in the basement preparing for a binding ceremony. These rituals require great concentration and spiritual openness. Sometimes the human vessel cannot contain the energies we invoke." Her heart simply stopped. Now, 37 years later, Morrison gripped his phone tighter. "Detective Chen, what exactly did you find?" "We found a hidden room during the renovation," Chen explained over the phone. "And Detective Morrison, there are things in there that were never part of the original investigation." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "I'll be there in an hour." The drive to Millbrook gave him time to remember what he'd tried so hard to forget. The basement where Sarah Thornfield had died was unlike any crime scene he'd encountered before or since. When he'd first descended those narrow wooden stairs in 1987, the beam of his flashlight had revealed something that belonged more in a museum of medieval artifacts than a family home. The basement had been divided into 2 sections. The front portion looked normal enough. Concrete floors, exposed beams, the usual detritus of suburban storage. But the back section, separated by a thick wooden door, was something else entirely. The floor was made of wide oak planks, and carved into those planks was an intricate pattern of symbols that spoke of rituals far older than Christianity. Sarah's body had been found in the center of it all, lying on her back with her arms spread wide. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness, and her dark hair fanned out around her head like spilled ink. Around her body, arranged in precise geometric patterns, were candles that had burned down to stubs, leaving pools of hardened wax that looked like small graves in the wooden floor. The symbols themselves had troubled Morrison from the moment he saw them. They weren't random scratches or amateur attempts at occult imagery. These had been carved with skill and precision, each line deep enough to catch shadows and create the illusion of movement in flickering candlelight. Pentagrams, yes, but also runic inscriptions that seemed to flow from one to the next like a written language. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained some fundamental wrongness that the human eye wasn't meant to process. Dr. Helen Voss, the county medical examiner, had been as disturbed as Morrison by what they'd found. She was a practical woman in her 50s, someone who'd seen every variety of human death and maintained her composure through autopsies that would send seasoned detectives running for fresh air. But in that basement she'd gone pale. "Ray," she'd whispered, kneeling beside Sarah's body, "look at her hands." Sarah's palms bore burn marks that were too precise to be accidental. They were geometric patterns, perfectly symmetrical, as if hot metal had been pressed into her flesh with deliberate care. The burns went deep, down to the muscle in some places, and they would have caused excruciating pain. "These weren't made post-mortem," Voss had said quietly. "She was alive when this happened, but that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that Sarah's expression was peaceful, almost serene. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted, as if she'd died in the middle of speaking. There was no sign of the agony those burns should have caused. No indication that she'd struggled or tried to escape. The family says she died during some kind of ritual," Morrison had told Voss. "They claim her heart just stopped." Voss had examined the body with professional thoroughness, photographing every detail before allowing it to be moved. The Polaroid picture she took that day became some of the most disturbing images in Morrison's case file. A young woman surrounded by occult symbols, her hands marked with burns that told of suffering beyond imagination. Later, when the autopsy results came back, they only deepened the mystery. Sarah's heart had indeed stopped, but there was no clear cause. No drugs in her system, no obvious trauma except for the burns on her hands. Her blood contained traces of herbs that Voss couldn't immediately identify, plants that didn't grow naturally in Vermont, exotic specimens that would have to be specially ordered. "It's like she just decided to die," Voss had said during one of their conversations. "But people don't just decide to die, Ray. Not like this." The forensics team had spent hours in that basement, photographing every symbol, measuring every angle, documenting the scene with the kind of precision usually reserved for federal cases. But the evidence they gathered only led to more questions. The symbols were old, carved over a period of years or possibly decades. The wax from the candles contained unusual compounds, suggesting they'd been specially made. And beneath it all, the wooden floor showed signs of repeated use, stains that had soaked deep into the grain, marks that suggested this wasn't the first time the basement had hosted such a gathering. Standing in that basement 37 years ago, Morrison had felt something he'd never experienced at a crime scene before: genuine fear. Not fear of violence or danger, but fear of something fundamentally wrong with the world. Something that his rational mind couldn't process or categorize. Morrison arrived at 1247 Elm Street to find it transformed. The Gothic Victorian that had once loomed over the neighborhood like a monument to old secrets now stood wrapped in scaffolding and construction tarps. Workers moved about with purpose, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of men who'd spent weeks together on a job site. But beneath their casual banter, Morrison detected an undercurrent of unease. Detective Sarah Chen met him at the curb. She was younger than he'd expected from her voice, probably early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded him of his younger self. Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct. "Thank you for coming, Detective Morrison. I know this case has special significance for you. Call me Ray. I haven't been Detective Morrison for 3 years now." He looked up at the house, noting how different it appeared in daylight, stripped of the shadows and fog that had given it such menace in 1987. "What exactly did your construction crew find?" Chen led him up the familiar walkway, past workers who paused in their labor to watch them with curious eyes. The new owners wanted to convert the basement into a family room. When they started tearing down the interior walls, they found something the original investigation missed. Inside, the house had been gutted. Gone were the heavy draperies and dark wallpaper, replaced by exposed studs and the bright glare of work lights. The air smelled of sawdust and drywall compound instead of candle wax and whatever else had given the place its distinctive odor. They descended into the basement, where Morrison felt the familiar chill of recognition. The symbolic carvings in the floor had been covered over with plywood during the years since the murder, but he could still sense their presence beneath his feet, like a wound that had healed badly. The false wall was here, Chen said, leading him to what had once been the back corner of the ritual space. Where Morrison remembered solid stone, workers had torn away a careful facade to reveal a hidden chamber barely large enough for 2 people to stand upright. The smell hit him first, must and age, but underneath that, something organic and sweet that made his stomach clench with memory. Chen handed him a flashlight, and together they stepped through the opening. The hidden room was a shrine to madness. The walls were covered in writing, layer upon layer of text in different hands, different inks, spanning what looked like decades. Some sections were in English, others in scripts Morrison didn't recognize. Names, dates, and symbols crowded every available surface, creating a tapestry of obsession that hurt to look at directly. "We've been photographing everything," Chen said, her voice carefully neutral. "Some of this writing goes back to the 1920s, maybe earlier. It appears to be some kind of family record." In the center of the small space stood a stone altar, rough-hewn and stained with substances Morrison preferred not to identify. Around its base were arranged artifacts that belonged in a museum of anthropology or a madman's collection. Carved figurines that seemed to writhe in the flashlight beam. Metal implements whose purpose was unclear but threatening. And containers filled with dried plants that gave off a nauseating sweetness when disturbed. But it was the book that drew Morrison's attention. Bound in what looked like leather but felt wrong beneath his fingers, it lay open on the altar to a page covered in careful handwriting. The writing was Edmund Thornfield's. Morrison recognized it from the statement the man had given in 1987. The Binding of Sarah. Read the page header, and below it, in meticulous detail, was a description of ritual murder disguised as spiritual ceremony. Chen watched Morrison's face as he read. There are 17 other entries like this one, Ray. 17 other bindings dating back to 1892, all family members, all described as willing participants in some kind of spiritual transformation. Morrison felt the weight of all those years pressing down on him. 17 murders spanning nearly a century, and he'd only known about one. Have you verified any of these other deaths? We're working on it. The older ones are harder to trace, but the pattern fits. Family members dying under mysterious circumstances, always during specific lunar phases, always ruled as accidents or natural causes. Chen paused, studying his expression. Ray, there's something else. Something that changes everything about Sarah's case. She led him to another section of the wall, where more recent writing covered the stone in desperate, hurried strokes. This handwriting was different, younger, more frantic. The words seemed to tumble over each other in their urgency. This is Sarah's writing, Chen said quietly. She found this room, Ray. She found it, and she was documenting everything. Look at the dates. Morrison followed her flashlight beam to a series of entries that made his blood run cold. The dates began 3 months before Sarah's death and continued right up to the day she died. Her final entry was barely legible, written in what looked like extreme haste. They know I know. Papa watches me constantly now. Mama speaks of my time coming soon. I have to get word to someone. But who would believe this? Who would believe that my own family has been murdering our blood for generations? If something happens to me, if I don't make it out, someone needs to know the truth. We are not practitioners of ancient wisdom. We are killers. We are killers who have hidden behind tradition and superstition for nearly 100 years. And I was supposed to be next. Morrison's hands trembled as he held Sarah's final words under the harsh glare of the work lights. 37 years of guilt and frustration crystallized into a single burning moment of clarity. She hadn't died in some mystical accident. She'd been murdered for trying to expose the truth. We need to interview the surviving family members, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Marcus, Lydia, and Edmund, if he's still alive. Chen nodded, pulling out her phone to check her notes. Edmund died in 1998. Natural causes, according to the death certificate, though given what we've found here, I'm inclined to be suspicious. Constance passed in 2003. Marcus is in a care facility in Burlington, has been for the last 15 years. Lydia disappeared shortly after her mother's death. No forwarding address, no contact with local authorities, and Thomas had died in a car accident in 1997, single vehicle crash on a clear night, no evidence of mechanical failure or alcohol involvement. Chen's expression was grim. The accident report notes that he'd been asking questions about the family history in the weeks before his death. Morrison felt the familiar weight of a conspiracy settling around him. In 1987, he'd sensed something wrong, but hadn't been able to put his finger on it. Now, with decades of perspective and this new evidence, the pattern was unmistakable. They spent the next 2 hours photographing and cataloguing everything in the hidden room. Each item seemed to tell part of a larger, more horrifying story. The dried herbs matched those found in Sarah's blood during the autopsy. The metal implements bore stains that would need testing. But Morrison had seen enough evidence over the years to recognize dried blood when he saw it. The book, that damned... leather-bound record of murder, contained detailed descriptions of each binding. Ceremony. Morrison forced himself to read several entries, his stomach churning with each clinical description of ritual killing disguised as spiritual practice. The earliest entry, dated 1892, described the death of Agnes Thornfield, age 16. According to the record, Agnes had shown signs of spiritual rebellion and needed to be bound to the family essence before her. Corruption could spread. The description that followed made Morrison understand why Thomas Thornfield had been asking uncomfortable questions before his convenient accident. "Ray," Chen called from the far corner of the room. "You need to see this." She was kneeling beside a wooden crate that had been hidden behind the altar. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were photographs. Not the formal family portraits Morrison might have expected, but candid shots that captured moments no camera should have witnessed. The photos showed family members in the basement ritual space, participating in ceremonies that made Morrison's skin crawl. Adults and children gathered around prone figures, their faces illuminated by candlelight that revealed expressions of fervent devotion mixed with something that looked disturbingly like hunger. But it was the final photograph that made Morrison's blood freeze. Sarah Thornfield, looking perhaps 17 or 18, stood at the edge of a ritual circle with an expression of absolute horror on her face. She was looking directly at the camera, and her eyes held the desperate appeal of someone who had finally understood the true nature of her family's traditions. "This was taken months before her death," Chen said quietly. "Look at the date stamp." Morrison examined the photo more closely. Sarah's expression wasn't just horror, it was determination. Even in that moment of terrible realization, she was already planning something, already deciding to fight back. They found more evidence of Sarah's investigation hidden throughout the room. She'd been methodical, documenting everything she could find, building a case against her own family. Tucked behind loose stones in the wall were copies of death certificates, newspaper clippings about mysterious accidents, and handwritten notes that showed a young woman desperately trying to understand the scope of her family's crimes. One note, written in Sarah's careful script, made Morrison's chest tighten with recognition. "Detective Morrison seems like a good man. If I can get evidence to him, maybe he'll listen. Maybe he'll believe me when I tell him what they really are." She'd been planning to come to him. She'd been planning to turn in her own family, and they'd killed her for it. "We need to exhume some bodies," Morrison said finally, "starting with Thomas. If the family was willing to kill Sarah to keep their secrets, they wouldn't have hesitated to eliminate Thomas when he started asking questions." Chen was already making notes. "I'll start the paperwork. But Ray, there's something else we need to consider. If this family has been operating for over a century, if they've managed to cover up 17 murders and make them look like accidents or natural deaths, they didn't do it alone." Morrison knew she was right. A conspiracy this deep, this long-lasting, required more than just one twisted family. It required help from people in positions of authority, coroners, police officers, judges, maybe even politicians. The kind of help that could make evidence disappear and questions stop being asked. As they prepared to leave the hidden room, Morrison took one last look around. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, decades of evil soaked into the very stones. But for the first time in 37 years, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of justice for Sarah Thornfield. The drive to Burlington felt longer than the actual 90 minutes it took. Morrison stared out the passenger window as Chen navigated the winding roads through Vermont's green hills, his mind churning through decades of suppressed memories. The case file sat heavy on his lap. He'd insisted on bringing the original documents, the ones he'd kept in his personal files long after the official investigation had been closed. Sunset Manor Care Facility squatted against the hillside like a concrete apology for the aging process. The building tried to project warmth with its earth-tone exterior and landscaped grounds. But Morrison had visited enough of these places to recognize the institutional sterility beneath the facade. Marcus Thornfield had been a resident for 15 years, according to Chen's research. Committed after a series of what the records diplomatically termed psychotic episodes, he'd spent his middle age cycling between psychiatric hospitals and halfway houses before, finally landing in long-term care. His attending physician says he has good days and bad days, Chen explained as they walked through the lobby. On good days, he's lucid but extremely anxious. On bad days, he talks about shadows and family obligations that need to be fulfilled. The nurse who led them to Marcus's room was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who spoke in the hushed tones common to places where death was a frequent visitor. He's been agitated all week, she warned them, ever since that story about the Thornfield house showed up in the local paper. He keeps saying his family is calling for him. Marcus Thornfield sat in a wheelchair by the window of his small room, staring out at the parking lot with the hollow gaze of a man who'd seen too much. At 56, he looked far older, his hair completely white, and his face marked by the kind of deep lines that come from years of internal torment rather than simple aging. When Morrison entered the room, Marcus turned with a speed that belied his frail appearance. His eyes widened with recognition that shouldn't have been possible after so many years. "Detective Morrison," he said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of relief and terror. "I've been waiting for you to come back. I knew you would eventually. I knew the house would call you back." Morrison pulled up a chair, settling himself at eye level with the man who might hold the key to finally solving Sarah's murder. "Hello, Marcus. I'd like to ask you some questions about your sister." Marcus's hands began to shake. "Which sister?" "I had 3 sisters, you know. Sarah was just the last one. Papa said she was the most important because she carried the strongest connection to the old ways, but I never understood what that meant until it was too late." Chen leaned forward. "Marcus, you told the police in 1987 that Sarah died during a family ceremony, that it was an accident. That's what Papa told me to say." Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "But accidents don't require preparation. Accidents don't need special knives and binding circles and words in languages that hurt your throat to speak." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "Tell me what really happened that night." Marcus closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice took on the cadence of someone reciting a story he'd told himself 1,000 times. Sarah had been different for months. She'd stopped participating in the family observances, stopped coming to the basement when Papa called us down. She'd ask questions that made Papa angry. Questions about Grandmother Constance's first daughter, about Uncle William who died when we were children. What kind of questions? Questions about the family tree, about why so many Thornfields died young, about why we were the only family in Millbrook who held ceremonies on nights when the moon was dark. Marcus opened his eyes, and Morrison saw decades of guilt swimming in their depths. "Sarah was smart, Detective Morrison. Smarter than the rest of us. She figured out what the ceremonies really were. And what were they?" Marcus was quiet for so long that Morrison thought he might have retreated into one of his episodes. But when he spoke again, his voice was clear and steady. "Blood sacrifices. That's what Papa called them when he thought we weren't listening. The family needed to maintain its strength, its connection to powers that ordinary people couldn't understand. Every few years, someone had to be chosen. Someone had to give their life to keep the rest of us strong." Chen exchanged a glance with Morrison. "Who chose Marcus?" "Papa, mostly. Sometimes Mama would have dreams that told her which of us was ready. They said it was an honor, that the chosen one would live forever as part of the family essence. But Sarah didn't want to be honored. She wanted to live." "Tell me about the night she died." Marcus's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair. Papa had been preparing for weeks. He'd marked the date on his special calendar, the one with symbols instead of numbers. Sarah knew what was coming. She'd been watching him, listening at doors, reading his books when he thought she was asleep. Did she try to run? She tried to get help first. She'd been writing letters, making phone calls, but Papa had friends everywhere. People who owed the family favors, People who'd been helped by our influence over the years. Marcus looked directly at Morrison. She wanted to come to you, Detective. She said you seemed like someone who might believe her, someone who might have the courage to act. Morrison felt the weight of 37 years of failure settling on his shoulders. But she never made it to me. Papa found her letters, found her evidence. That night, he called a family meeting in the basement, said it was time for Sarah to fulfill her destiny. But it wasn't like the other ceremonies, Detective. The other chosen ones had always been willing, or at least resigned to their fate. Sarah fought. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if finally speaking the truth after decades of enforced silence was giving him power he'd forgotten he possessed. Sarah screamed when Papa brought out the ceremonial knife. It was old, Detective Morrison, older than the house itself. Papa said it had been used for bindings since the family first came to America. The blade was stained black with the blood of our ancestors. Morrison leaned forward, his notebook forgotten in his lap. Where are the other family members now, Marcus? Lydia disappeared after your mother died. Lydia never recovered from that night. She was only 16, and Papa made her participate. Made her hold Sarah down while he spoke the binding words. Marcus shuddered. After Mama passed, Lydia came to see me one last time. She said she was going somewhere Papa's ghost couldn't find her, somewhere the family curse couldn't follow. Do you know where she went? West, maybe California, maybe Oregon. She said she was going to change her name, find work, where nobody knew about the Thornfields. She was always the smartest of us after Sarah. Marcus paused, studying Morrison's face. But you can't run from what you've done, Detective. The guilt follows you everywhere. Chen had been taking notes throughout the conversation, but now she looked up. Marcus, you mentioned that your father had friends who helped cover things up. Do you remember any names? Marcus nodded slowly. Dr. Kellerman was the coroner back then. He'd been Papa's friend since they were boys together. He made sure the death certificates always said what Papa needed them to say. And Judge Brennan, he'd come to the house sometimes for Papa's other ceremonies, the ones that weren't about binding. Other ceremonies. Business ceremonies. Papa said the family's influence came from more than just blood sacrifice. He said we had to cultivate relationships with people in power, help them achieve their desires in exchange for their loyalty. Marcus's expression grew distant. I was too young to understand what that meant then, but I've had years to think about it. Morrison felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Marcus, in 1987, when I interviewed your family, everyone seemed to know exactly what to say. Like you'd all rehearsed your stories, because we had. Papa spent 3 days after Sarah died, drilling us on what to tell the police. He said Sarah's sacrifice had been particularly powerful because of her resistance, but that outsiders wouldn't understand the sacred nature of what we'd done. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water on his bedside table. He told us that if we spoke the truth, the family would be destroyed, and Sarah's death would have been meaningless. But you're speaking the truth now. Because I'm dying, Detective Morrison. The doctors don't think I have much time left, and I'm tired of carrying Sarah's screams in my head. Marcus met Morrison's eyes directly. She called your name that night. When Papa brought out the knife, when she realized no one was coming to save her, she called for you. She said you'd promised her in her dreams that you'd find the truth. Morrison felt something cold settle in his chest. I never met Sarah before she died, Marcus. Maybe not in this world. But Papa always said the chosen ones could see across the barriers between life and death. Maybe she saw you coming, Detective. Maybe she knew that someday someone would care enough about her to dig up the truth. The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of institutional life. Footsteps in hallways, muffled conversations, the electronic beeping of medical equipment. Morrison stared at Marcus, trying to process the implications of what he'd just heard. Marcus, Chen said gently, we found evidence in the hidden room that suggests your family killed other people over the years. 17 victims spanning nearly a century. 17 that you found, Marcus corrected. But there were others, Detective Chen. People who weren't family, but who threatened our secrets. Neighbors who asked too many questions. researchers who got too interested in local history, officials who couldn't be bought or threatened. How many others? Marcus closed his eyes. I stopped counting after I realized that my entire life had been built on a foundation of murder. Every comfort I'd enjoyed, every advantage the family name had given me, was paid for with someone else's blood. We need locations. Marcus, names, anything you can remember that might help us find evidence. There's a place in the woods behind the house. Papa called it the true sanctuary. It's where he disposed of the ones who weren't worthy of binding ceremonies, the ones who were just obstacles to be removed. Marcus opened his eyes, and Morrison saw a clarity there that had been absent before. If you want proof of what the Thornfield family really was, Detective Morrison, that's where you'll find it. Chen was already making notes. Can you give us directions? Follow the old logging road that starts behind the carriage house. About half a mile in, there's a stone marker carved with the same symbols you found in the basement. The sanctuary is 50 yards north of that marker, in a clearing that never grows anything green. Morrison stood, feeling the weight of decades finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. Marcus, why are you telling us this now? After all these years of silence. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since they'd entered his room, he looked peaceful. Because Sarah deserves justice, Detective Morrison, and because I'm finally ready to stop being afraid of my father's ghost. The drive back to Millbrook took place in heavy silence. Jen focused on the road while Morrison stared out at the darkening landscape, his mind processing 37 years of misplaced guilt. Sarah had called his name as she died, according to Marcus. She'd believed he would find the truth, even as her own family murdered her. They arrived at the Thornfield property as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds behind the house. The construction crew had gone home for the day, leaving the Victorian standing alone against the twilight like a monument to old sins. Chen had called ahead for a forensics team and ground-penetrating radar equipment. If Marcus was telling the truth about bodies in the woods, they would need professional help to locate and properly excavate whatever lay hidden there. The old logging road was barely visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and encroaching vegetation. Morrison led the way with a high-powered flashlight, following what remained of the rutted path as it wound deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches creating a canopy so thick that very little of the dying daylight penetrated to the forest floor. There, Chen said, pointing ahead to where a pale shape emerged from the gloom. The stone marker stood about 4 feet high, its surface covered with the same symbols they'd found carved into the basement floor. But these carvings were older, more weathered, suggesting they'd been made decades or even centuries ago. The stone itself was different from anything native to Vermont, a type of granite that would have had to be imported at considerable expense. Morrison ran his flashlight over the carved symbols, noting their precision despite their age. Someone put a lot of effort into this, and a lot of planning. Chen was using her phone to photograph the marker from multiple angles. This isn't some amateur occult nonsense. This is the work of people who took their beliefs very seriously. They found the clearing exactly where Marcus had said it would be, 50 yards north of the marker, in a depression that felt wrong even before they understood why. The ground was barren, despite the rich soil that supported dense forest growth everywhere else. No grass, no wildflowers, no small trees struggling toward the light. Just bare earth that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams without reflecting any illumination back. Jesus, Chen breathed, sweeping her light across the clearing. How big do you think this area is? Morrison paced off the dimensions, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Maybe 40 feet by 60 feet. That's a lot of space for a family burial ground, or a dumping ground. The forensics team arrived an hour later, their equipment trucks rumbling down the logging road with difficulty. Dr. Patricia Wells, the current county medical examiner, supervised the setup of ground-penetrating radar while her technicians established a grid system across the clearing. Morrison had worked with Wells on several cases since his retirement, consulting on cold cases that needed an experienced eye. She was thorough and professional, but he could see the skepticism in her expression as she surveyed the allegedly haunted clearing. "You really think there are bodies here, Ray? I think the Thornfield family has been hiding something in these woods for a very long time." Morrison watched the technicians adjust their equipment. "And I think Sarah Thornfield died because she was about to expose it. The radar results began coming in after midnight." Wells studied the printouts with growing amazement, her skepticism evaporating as the evidence mounted. "Ray, you need to see this." She spread the radar images across a folding table illuminated by portable work lights. "We've got at least 12 distinct anomalies consistent with human burials. Some of them look recent, within the last few decades, but some of these signatures suggest much older interments." Morrison studied the geometric patterns on the printouts. The burial sites weren't random. They were arranged in the same symbolic patterns they'd found in the basement, creating a larger design that could only be seen from above. "It's a massive ritual site," Chen said, her voice hushed with the implications. "They weren't just killing family members. They were creating some kind of occult monument." Wells pointed to several clusters of anomalies. "These groupings here and here look like they might be family burials, adults and children together. But these isolated signatures around the perimeter could be the outsiders Marcus mentioned. How long will it take to excavate? If we're careful about preserving evidence and maintaining chain of custody, weeks, maybe months. This is going to be one of the largest forensic archaeology projects in Vermont history." Morrison felt a mixture of vindication and horror as he stared at the radar results. For 37 years, he'd known something was wrong with Sarah Thornfield's death. Now he was looking at evidence of what might be the longest-running serial murder case in American history. "Dr. Wells," he said finally, "I want you to start with the most recent burials. If we're right about Thomas Thornfield being murdered in 1997, we might find evidence that could lead to arrests of people who are still alive." Wells nodded, already making notes about excavation priorities. "Ray, if what you're suggesting is true, if this family really has been killing people for over a century, then we're not just looking at a cold case. We're looking at a conspiracy that could involve half the power structure of this county." Morrison thought about Dr. Kellerman and Judge Brennan, about all the officials who'd helped cover up the Thornfield family's crimes over the decades. "Then we'd better be very careful about who we trust with what we find here." The first body came up 3 days later. Morrison stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching Dr. Wells and her team work with the painstaking care of archaeologists uncovering a pharaoh's tomb. The forensic tent they'd erected over the clearing buzzed with controlled activity as technicians photographed, measured and catalogued every detail of the dig. The remains belonged to a young woman, probably in her early 20s, buried in what appeared to be a wooden coffin that had long since rotted away. But it was the artifacts buried with her that made Morrison's blood run cold. "The symbols match," Wells said, pointing to metal amulets arranged around the skeleton's neck and wrists. "Same design as the ones carved into the basement floor and the stone marker." Chen knelt beside the remains, studying the position of the bones. "Any signs of trauma?" "Multiple fractures consistent with blunt force trauma to the skull." "Someone beat this woman to death." Wells stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "But that's not the strangest part. Look at this." She led them to a metal tablet that had been buried at the head of the grave. Despite decades in the ground, the engraved text was still clearly visible. "Agnes Thornfield, beloved daughter, bound to the eternal family. October 31st, 1892. "That's the first entry in the ledger we found in the hidden room," Morrison said. "Agnes Thornfield, age 16, died during a binding ceremony." "She wasn't 16, Wells corrected. "Based on the bone development and dental evidence, this woman was at least 22, maybe older, and she'd given birth to at least one child." Chen looked up from her notes. "So either the family records are wrong, or this isn't Agnes Thornfield." "Or," Morrison said slowly, "the family was lying about a lot more than just how people died. The second excavation began that afternoon, focusing on one of the more recent burial sites. This time, they found a man in his 30s, buried with similar ritual objects, but in a metal coffin that had preserved more evidence. The metal nameplate read, Thomas Thornfield, faithful son, bound to the eternal family, November 15th, 1997. That's 3 weeks after Thomas supposedly died in a car accident, Chen said, consulting her files. But if this is Thomas, then who was buried in the official funeral? Wells was examining the remains with particular attention to the skull. This man didn't die in a car accident. He was shot, probably with a small caliber weapon fired at close range. The bullet penetrated just behind the left ear and lodged in the opposite side of the skull. Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Thomas started asking questions about the family history. Marcus told us that. So they killed him and faked the car accident to cover it up. But whose body did they use for the official funeral? Chen asked. The answer came 2 days later when they excavated a third site. This one containing the remains of a homeless man whose identification had been found with the body. John Peterson, age 34, had been reported missing from Burlington in November 1997, the same month as Thomas Thornfield's supposed accident. They killed a homeless man and used his body as a stand-in, Wells explained as they examined the evidence. Burned it beyond recognition in the staged car crash. Then buried the real Thomas here with full ritual honors. Morrison stared at the 3 graves they'd uncovered so far, trying to comprehend the scope of what they were discovering. How many more are there? Based on the radar results, at least 9 more burials. But Ray, there's something else you need to see. Wells led him to a section of the clearing where her team had been working with metal detectors. They'd uncovered a cache of objects buried separately from the bodies, a collection of personal items that told stories more horrifying than the remains themselves. Driver's licenses, jewelry, photographs, and other personal effects were arranged in neat rows on examination tables. The dates spanned from the 1920s to the late 1990s, representing decades of victims whose disappearances had never been connected to the Thornfield family. These aren't all family members, Chen said, studying a photograph of a young couple standing beside a 1960s-era car. Some of these people were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Morrison picked up a driver's license belonging to Maria Santos, a 23-year-old woman from Massachusetts. According to the date, she'd gone missing in 1985, 2 years before Sarah's death. Her photograph showed a bright smile and hopeful eyes that would never see another sunrise. They were hunting people, he said quietly. The family members were ritual sacrifices, but these others were just prey. Wells nodded grimly. And based on the condition of some of these items, I don't think the hunting stopped with Thomas Thornfield's death in 1997. Some of these personal effects are much more recent. How recent? There's a cell phone here that didn't exist before, 2010, and a college ID from 2015. Wells held up a student identification card bearing the photo of a young man with sandy hair and an uncertain smile. David Chen, age 19, University of Vermont. Chen looked up sharply. That's my cousin. He disappeared during his sophomore year. The family thought he'd dropped out and just didn't want to contact us. Morrison felt the weight of the investigation shifting beneath his feet. If the Thornfield murders had continued into the 21st century, then someone was still alive who knew the truth about Sarah's death. Someone who might still be killing. The discovery of David Chen's ID transformed the investigation from a historical cold case into an active hunt for a living killer. Chen stared at her cousin's photograph with a mixture of grief and rage that Morrison recognized from his own mirror. 37 years earlier, he was supposed to be the first in our family to graduate. College, she said quietly. My aunt and uncle mortgaged their house to pay his tuition. When he disappeared, they blamed themselves for not calling him enough, not visiting more often. Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder. We're going to find who did this, Sarah. All of it. Wells continued cataloguing the personal effects, but her expression grew increasingly troubled as the evidence mounted. "Ray, I need to show you something. We found this buried deeper than the others, in what looks like a place of honor." She led them to a separate examination table, where a single item lay under bright laboratory lights. It was a tape recorder, old-fashioned, but in remarkably good condition, considering its time in the ground. Attached to it was a metal tag reading, "The Confession of Sarah Thornfield, October 30th, 1987. The battery compartment was filled with preservative gel, Wells explained. "Someone wanted to make sure this would survive." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "Can we play it?" "The electronics are shot, but we might be able to recover the tape itself. I know a specialist in Burlington who works with audio restoration for criminal cases." While they waited for the tape analysis, Morrison and Chen drove to the University of Vermont to investigate David Chen's disappearance. The campus police records painted a picture that was becoming disturbingly familiar. A bright, curious student who'd started asking questions about local history in the weeks before he vanished. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, who'd taught David's American folklore course, remembered him clearly. David was fascinated by local legends and family traditions. He was working on a research project about generational trauma and ritual violence in rural communities. "Did he mention the Thornfield family specifically?" Chen asked. "Oh, yes. He'd found some fascinating material about them in the university archives. Historical documents, old newspaper clippings, even some photographs from the early 1900s. Professor Hartwell paused, studying Chen's expression. He was particularly interested in patterns of unexplained deaths in Millbrook over the past century. Morrison exchanged a glance with Chen. "What kind of patterns?" David had created a timeline showing spikes in mysterious deaths and disappearances that seemed to correlate with lunar phases and seasonal transitions. He was convinced there was some kind of ritualistic element to the killings that local authorities had either missed or deliberately ignored. They spent 2 hours going through David's research materials, finding detailed notes that showed a young man systematically uncovering the same conspiracy that had cost Sarah Thornfield her life. His final research entry was dated 3 days before his disappearance, "Meeting with source tomorrow, who claims to have inside knowledge of Thornfield family activities. If something happens to me, contact Detective Morrison, retired. He investigated the Sarah Thornfield case in 1987. "He knew about you," Chen said, staring at the entry. "Somehow he'd figured out that you might be the one person who would believe him." Morrison felt the familiar chill of a case that reached across decades to touch the present. "But he never made it to me. Just like Sarah never made it to me. The tape restoration took 3 days. When Dr. Amanda Foster, the audio specialist, finally called them back to Burlington, her voice carried an excitement that bordered on unprofessional enthusiasm. "I've never heard anything like this," she said as they gathered around her equipment. "The quality is remarkably good for something that's been buried for 37 years. But more than that, it's clear that whoever made this recording was extremely methodical about documenting evidence." She pressed play. When Sarah Thornfield's voice filled the room, young, frightened, but determined to speak the truth even if it cost her everything. "My name is Sarah Elizabeth Thornfield, and I'm recording this on October 30th, 1987. If you're listening to this, it means they've killed me. And someone finally found the courage to dig up our family's secrets." Morrison closed his eyes, hearing in Sarah's voice the same intelligence and determination that had made him suspect the official story of her death. "I've been documenting my family's crimes for the past 6 months. What outsiders see as eccentric traditions are actually ritual murders that go back to the founding of our family line in America. We are not practitioners of ancient wisdom. We are killers who have hidden behind superstition and community influence for over a century." The recording continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah methodically describing each entry in the family's murder ledger, providing names, dates, and locations that corroborated everything Morrison and Chen had discovered in their investigation. But it was her final words that hit Morrison like a physical blow. "Detective Morrison, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry I never got the chance to meet you in person. I'd planned to bring you this recording tomorrow, along with all my evidence. I believe you're the only person in law enforcement who has the integrity to act on what I've discovered. Please don't let my death be meaningless. Please make sure the world knows what the Thornfield family really is." The recording ended in silence, leaving Morrison staring at the equipment with tears he hadn't shed in decades burning his eyes. The weight of Sarah's voice lingered in the audio lab long after the recording ended. Morrison sat in silence, processing the implications of what they'd just heard. Sarah had been murdered the day before she was supposed to bring him evidence that could have prevented decades of additional killings. "We need to find Lydia," Chen said finally. "She's the only surviving family member who might be able to tell us who's continuing the murders." Morrison nodded, though part of him dreaded the conversation they would need to have with Sarah's surviving sister. "Marcus said she went west. That's a lot of territory to cover." "Maybe not." Chen was already pulling out her phone. "If she's still alive, she'd be in her 50s now. Social security records, tax filings, voter registrations, there's always a paper trail." They drove back to Millbrook in contemplative silence, both lost in thoughts about the case that seemed to grow more complex with each discovery. The excavation site hummed with activity as Wells's team continued their methodical work, uncovering evidence that would take months to fully analyze. Chen's phone rang as they pulled into the forensic command center that had been established in the Thornfield driveway. She listened for several minutes, making notes before hanging up with a grim expression. "That was the FBI. They're taking over the investigation." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "On what grounds?" "Interstate murder conspiracy spanning multiple decades. They're treating this as a RICO case now." Chen's frustration was evident in her voice. "They want us to hand over all evidence and step back while they conduct their own investigation. Like hell." Morrison turned toward the house where he could see federal agents already setting up their own command structure. "I've been chasing this case for 37 years. I'm not stepping back now." Agent Rebecca Martinez, the FBI team leader, was a woman in her early 40s, with the kind of professional competence that came from years of handling complex cases. She listened to Morrison's concerns with apparent sympathy before delivering the bureaucratic equivalent of a polite dismissal. "Mr. Morrison, we understand your emotional investment in this case, but we're dealing with what appears to be a multi-generational criminal organization with connections across state lines. This requires federal resources and expertise. What about the local angle? The corruption that allowed this to continue for so long?" Martinez's expression grew carefully neutral. "That's part of our investigation, certainly. But we need to maintain operational security while we determine the scope of the conspiracy." Morrison recognized the language of a federal takeover. Chen would be allowed to participate as a liaison, but he would be frozen out entirely, relegated to the status of an interested civilian with no official standing. That night, alone in his house for the first time since the investigation began, Morrison sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by photocopies of the case files he'd maintained for 37 years. Somewhere in these documents was a clue about who might still be alive, who might still be killing. He started with the list of officials who'd helped cover up the Thornfield murders over the decades. Dr. Kellerman had died in 2001. Judge Brennan had passed in 2005, but there were others, lawyers, politicians, business leaders who'd benefited from the family's influence over the years. One name kept appearing in the margins of his notes: William Graves, who'd served as Millbrook's mayor during the 1980s and had been instrumental in shutting down Morrison's original investigation. Graves had retired from politics in the early 1990s, but had remained a prominent figure in local business circles. Morrison's phone rang at 11 p.m. The caller ID showed Chen's number. But her voice was hushed and urgent when she answered. "Ray, I'm calling from my car. I think someone's been watching my apartment. Where are you now?" "Parked outside the police station." "Ray, I did some digging into William Graves after the FBI told us to back off. He's not just some retired politician. His family has been connected to the Thornfields for generations." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of connections?" "Marriage records going back to the 1920s, business partnerships, property transfers. And Ray, William Graves has a son who works in law enforcement, local or federal." "Federal." "Agent Rebecca Martinez's partner on the FBI team is Special Agent David Graves, William's son." Morrison closed his eyes, feeling the familiar sensation of a case spiraling beyond his control. "They're not taking over the investigation, Sarah. They're covering it up. What do we do?" Morrison looked at the case files spread across his table, at 37 years of evidence that someone was clearly determined to bury again. "We do what Sarah Thornfield was trying to do in 1987. We find someone we can trust, and we make sure the truth gets out. Who can we trust if we can't trust the FBI?" Morrison thought about that question for a long moment. Remember what Professor Hartwell said about David Chen? He was documenting everything he found, just like Sarah did. Maybe he left evidence somewhere the killers haven't found yet. His dormitory room was cleaned out after he disappeared. His family never found any research materials, but he was working on this for months before he disappeared. Smart students don't keep all their research in one place. Morrison stood, reaching for his jacket. "Meet me at the university." If David Chen was half as thorough as Sarah Thornfield, he left us a roadmap to whoever killed him. The university library stood dark and imposing against the midnight sky, but Morrison knew that academic buildings were never truly closed to those who understood how institutions worked. Chen used her police credentials to convince the night security guard to let them access the research archives where David Chen had spent his final weeks. The basement level of the library housed decades of student research projects, thesis papers, and academic materials that had accumulated like sediment over the years. Finding David's work among the thousands of boxes and filing cabinets seemed impossible until Chen remembered something Professor Hartwell had mentioned. She said David was meticulous about backing up his work. If he was paranoid enough to worry about something happening to him, he would have hidden copies of everything he found. They started with the microfilm archives, reasoning that someone researching historical patterns would need access to old newspaper records. The logbook showed David had signed in repeatedly during September and October 2015, always requesting materials related to Millbrook and surrounding towns. "Look at this," Chen said, pointing to an entry dated 3 days before David's disappearance. He requested materials about the Graves family specifically. Morrison felt a chill of recognition. He'd figured out the connection between the Thornfields and their protectors in local government. They found David's research hidden in plain sight, disguised as a senior thesis project, filed under a false student ID number that he'd apparently created for security purposes. The folder contained hundreds of pages of photocopied documents, photographs, and handwritten notes that painted a picture of conspiracy far broader than anything Morrison had imagined. David had traced the Thornfield influence through 5 generations of Millbrook leadership. The pattern was consistent. Young people disappeared during specific lunar phases. Deaths were ruled accidental or natural, and anyone who asked too many questions either left town or had fatal accidents themselves. But it was David's genealogical research that provided the missing piece of the puzzle. He'd discovered that the Thornfield family line hadn't ended with Thomas's death in 1997. Edmund Thornfield had fathered a child outside his marriage in the 1960s, a son who'd been raised by adoptive parents and had grown up unaware of his true heritage. Michael Graves. Chen read from David's notes. Born 1967, adopted by William and Patricia Graves. Currently employed as special agent with the FBI. Morrison stared at the family tree David had painstakingly constructed. Agent Martinez's partner isn't just the son of a corrupt politician. He's Edmund Thornfield's biological son, and he's been in a position to monitor any federal investigation into his family's crimes for the past 20 years. Chen continued, reading through David's research. Ray, look at this list of cases Agent Graves has been involved with. The list made Morrison's blood run cold. Missing persons cases throughout New England, all involving young people who'd been researching local history or folklore. All cases that had been quietly closed without resolution, filed away in federal databases where local investigators would never see the connections. He's been hunting people like David and Sarah for decades, Morrison said, using federal resources to identify threats to the family secret, then eliminating them before they could expose the truth. Chen found David's final entries, written in increasingly frantic handwriting as he realized the scope of what he'd uncovered. Listen to this. I think they know I'm onto them. Someone's been through my dorm room while I was in class. My research advisor asked strange questions about my thesis project. I'm going to hide copies of everything, then try to contact Detective Morrison. If something happens to me, look for the backup files in the old Thornfield carriage house. I've hidden them where only someone who understands the family's ritual patterns would think to look. Morrison and Chen exchanged glances. The carriage house on the Thornfield property had been boarded up for decades, considered too structurally unsound for the renovation crew to work on. We need to get back there before the FBI realizes what we've found, Morrison said. They drove through the empty streets of Millbrook, with Chen constantly checking her mirrors for signs of surveillance. The Thornfield property was quiet, the forensic lights in the woods creating an eerie glow against the trees. But no federal agents were visible around the main house. The carriage house squatted behind the Victorian, like a forgotten afterthought, its windows boarded and its roof sagging with decades of neglect. Morrison used a crowbar from Chen's police vehicle to pry off the boards covering the front entrance. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sweet smell of rot that seemed to permeate every Thornfield property. But Chen's flashlight revealed something unexpected, footprints in the dust. Recent ones that led directly to a corner where the wooden floor had been carefully pried up and replaced. Someone's been here recently, Morrison said, kneeling beside the disturbed floorboards. Chen helped him lift the loose planks, revealing a metal box wrapped in plastic and hidden in the space beneath. Inside were copies of all David's research, plus additional materials he'd gathered in his final weeks, including photographs that made Morrison's hands shake as he examined them. The photos showed a ritual gathering that had taken place in the woods behind the Thornfield house, but these weren't historical images. The digital timestamps indicated they'd been taken in 2015, just weeks before David's disappearance. In the center of the ritual circle stood a figure Morrison recognized from FBI credentials, Special Agent Michael Graves, wearing robes that marked him as the leader of a ceremony that looked identical to the family rituals described in Edmund Thornfield's journals. He's continuing the tradition, Chen whispered. David found proof that the murders never stopped. The photographs in David's hidden cache told a story that made Morrison's decades of police experience feel inadequate. The images showed not just Michael Graves conducting ritual murders, but other figures in the background, people whose faces were partially visible in the firelight. That's Judge Morrison's son, Chen said, pointing to a younger man standing at the edge of the ritual circle. Kevin Morrison. He's a prosecutor in the county attorney's office. Morrison stared at the photograph, recognizing the family resemblance despite the ceremonial robes and ritual makeup. And that woman there looks like Dr. Patricia Wells. Chen examined the image more closely. It can't be. Dr. Wells is helping with the excavation. She's the one who's been analyzing all the evidence, which would make her the perfect person to control what evidence gets documented and what mysteriously disappears. Morrison felt the case shifting beneath his feet once again. Sarah, how many of the people we've been trusting are actually part of this conspiracy? They continued examining David's photographs, finding image after image that revealed the scope of the network that had protected the Thornfield family for generations. Local officials, state police officers, federal agents, medical examiners, all participating in rituals that bound them to a conspiracy of silence and murder. "This isn't just about the Thornfield family," Chen said quietly. "This is about an entire power structure, built on ritual murder and occult control." Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking or join your predecessor, Sarah. The family takes care of its own, but outsiders become offerings." Chen read the message over his shoulder. "They know we found David's research, which means we need to move fast." Morrison stood, gathering the photographs and documents. "We need to get this evidence to someone outside the local power structure, someone who can't be bought or threatened." Who? If Michael Graves can monitor federal investigations, and if the conspiracy reaches into state and local law enforcement, who's left? Morrison thought about that question as they prepared to leave the carriage house. Then he remembered something from David's research, a note about a journalist who'd been asking questions about missing persons cases in rural New England. "Rebecca Walsh," he said. "She's an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe." David mentioned her in his notes as someone who might be willing to publish the story if something happened to him. They drove toward Boston in the pre-dawn darkness, taking back roads and constantly checking for surveillance. Morrison called Walsh from a burner phone Chen had picked up at a convenience store, explaining just enough about their situation to convince her to meet them. Walsh was waiting in a 24-hour diner near Cambridge when they arrived, her laptop already open and her recorder ready. She was younger than Morrison had expected, probably in her early 30s, but her questions showed the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her reputation as an investigative journalist. "You're telling me there's been a multi-generational conspiracy to commit ritual murders in rural Vermont, and that it reaches into federal law enforcement?" Her tone was skeptical but interested. Morrison spread David's photographs across the diner table. "I'm telling you that a young man named David Chen died because he uncovered evidence of murders dating back over a century. And I'm telling you that if we don't expose this story today, more people are going to die." Walsh examined the photographs with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen evidence of human depravity before. But Morrison could see her reporter's instincts responding to the documentation David had provided. These ritual objects, these symbols, they're consistent across all the crime scenes? She asked. "Identical. And the FBI agent who's supposed to be investigating the case is actually the biological son of the family patriarch who started the murders." Walsh spent 2 hours going through David's research, asking pointed questions and taking detailed notes. Morrison could see her building the story in her mind, understanding the implications of what they'd uncovered. "I'll need corroborating sources," she said finally. "Someone else who can verify at least part of this story." "Marcus Thornfield," Chen suggested. "He's in a care facility in Burlington. He's already confessed to everything on record. And Lydia Thornfield, if we can find her. She's the only other surviving family member who witnessed the murders firsthand." Walsh nodded, making notes. "How long do I have before this story gets buried again?" Morrison checked his watch. It was nearly dawn, and by now the FBI team would have discovered their absence from Millbrook. "Hours, maybe less. Once they realize we've found David's evidence, they'll move to contain the situation. Then we'd better work fast." Walsh closed her laptop and stood. "I'll start making calls to my editors while you track down these additional sources. But Mr. Morrison, if even half of what you've told me is true, you're both in serious danger." Morrison thought about Sarah Thornfield's voice on that recovered recording, about David Chen's desperate attempt to expose the truth before he was silenced. "Some things are more important than safety. Ms. Walsh, sometimes the truth is worth the risk." The Hunt for Lydia Thornfield took Morrison and Chen across 3 states and through a maze of false identities that showed the lengths to which someone would go to escape their family's legacy. They finally tracked her to a small coastal town in Oregon, where she lived under the name Linda Thompson and worked as a librarian in a place where nobody asked questions about the past. Lydia answered her apartment door with the wariness of someone who'd spent decades looking over her shoulder. At 53, she bore little resemblance to the frightened 16-year-old Morrison remembered from 1987. Her hair was grey, her face lined with the kind of permanent tension that comes from carrying terrible secrets, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much. Detective Morrison, she said quietly. I wondered when you'd finally find me. Miss Thornfield, we need to talk about your family, about Sarah's death and what's happened since then. Lydia glanced nervously up and down the hallway before stepping aside to let them enter. Her apartment was spartanly furnished, the kind of place where someone could pack up and disappear at a moment's notice. But the walls were covered with newspaper clippings, missing persons reports, unsolved murders, mysterious disappearances from across the country. I've been tracking them, she said, noticing Morrison's attention to the clippings. Every few years, the pattern repeats itself somewhere new. Young people disappear during ritual dates. Investigations get quietly shut down. Evidence disappears. Chen studied the timeline Lydia had created on one wall. You think the murders continued after your brother Thomas died? I know they did. Michael contacted me in 1998, right after Papa's funeral. He told me the family traditions would continue, that I could either participate or be silenced like Thomas was. Lydia's voice carried the flat tone of someone recounting a nightmare. I chose a third option. I ran, but you've been documenting their activities ever since. Lydia nodded toward a filing cabinet in the corner. Everything I could find. Michael's been smart about it, never staying in one place too long, always using his federal credentials to control investigations. But he makes mistakes. He's too proud of the family legacy to completely hide what he's doing. Morrison felt pieces clicking into place. Where is he now? Vermont. He goes back there every few years for the major ceremonies. Halloween, winter solstice, spring equinox. The old ritual calendar that Papa followed. Lydia checked her watch. And tomorrow night is the autumn equinox. If he's following tradition, he'll be conducting a binding ceremony in the woods behind the house. Who's the intended victim? Lydia's expression grew even more grave. Someone who's been asking too many questions about the family history. Someone who represents a threat to the conspiracy. She looked directly at Chen. Detective Chen, your investigation has made you a target. Michael will want to eliminate you before the story can spread. Chen went pale. How do you know that? Because I've been monitoring federal communications. Michael put in a request 3 days ago for surveillance equipment and backup personnel for what he called an operation to contain security leaks related to an ongoing investigation. Lydia pulled out a tablet and showed them intercepted messages. He's planning to stage your death as a suicide brought on by stress from the investigation. Morrison felt cold fury building in his chest. Not if we stop him first. You can't stop him, Detective Morrison. He has federal resources, local support, and decades of experience covering up murders. The best you can do is expose the truth and hope that someone with more power than Michael decides to act on it. Rebecca Walsh is already working on the story, but she needs more corroboration. Then I'll give it to her. Lydia moved to her filing cabinet and began pulling out folders. I have 30 years of documentation about the conspiracy. Names, dates, locations, financial records, showing how the network has been funded. Everything an investigative journalist would need to build an unshakable case. She handed Morrison a thick folder labeled The Network. Inside were organizational charts showing connections between the Thornfield murders and similar cases across the country, financial documents revealing how ritual artifacts and rare herbs were procured, and correspondence between conspiracy members that spelled out their methods in chilling detail. This is bigger than just one family, Chen said, studying the charts. This is a national network of ritual killers, 17 families operating in 12 states, with connections to law enforcement and government officials at every level. Lydia's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting a battle she couldn't win. The Thornfields were just one branch of something much larger. Morrison stared at the evidence, understanding finally why Sarah's murder had been so efficiently covered up. How long has this been going on? Since the late 1800s, as far as I can determine. Families who brought old world traditions to America and found ways to practice them in secret. They help each other, protect each other, and eliminate threats to their collective survival. But you survived. You've been fighting them for 30 years, Lydia smiled sadly. I survived because I stayed hidden and kept moving, but Detective Chen doesn't have that luxury. She's already been identified as a threat, and tomorrow night Michael will try to complete the ritual that binds her life force to the family power. Chen looked at Morrison. We need to get this evidence to Rebecca Walsh immediately. If the story breaks before tomorrow night, maybe Michael won't risk conducting the ceremony. Or maybe, Lydia said quietly, he'll accelerate his timeline and try to eliminate all of us tonight. The flight back to Boston felt like a race against time itself. Morrison sat beside Chen in the cramped airplane cabin, both of them acutely aware that every hour brought them closer to what Lydia had called the binding. Chen tried to maintain her professional composure, but Morrison could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he imagined Sarah Thornfield had felt in her final days. Rebecca Walsh needs to publish the story tonight, Chen said, checking her phone for the 12th time. If it breaks before midnight, maybe the publicity will force Michael to abandon the ceremony. Morrison wasn't so optimistic. 30 years of retirement had taught him that people who killed for religious reasons were often willing to die for those same beliefs. More likely, he'll see it as confirmation that you need to be silenced immediately. They landed in Boston to find 3 missed calls from Walsh and a text message that made Morrison's blood run cold. Story killed by editors. Outside pressure applied. Meet me at original location. Come alone. Chen read the message over his shoulder. They got to her editors. Or they got to her. Morrison stood, scanning the airport terminal for signs of surveillance. This could be a trap. Then we need backup. Real backup, not local law enforcement that might be compromised. Morrison thought about their options. The FBI was clearly compromised. State police might include conspiracy members. Local media had already been silenced. What about the state attorney general's office? They'd have jurisdiction over corruption cases involving federal agents. Chen was already making calls as they walked through the terminal. After 20 minutes of being transferred between departments, she finally reached someone willing to listen, Assistant Attorney General Patricia Moss, who specialized in prosecuting corruption cases involving law enforcement. They met Moss at a coffee shop near the Massachusetts State House, where she listened to their story with the skeptical attention of a prosecutor who'd heard every possible excuse for criminal behavior. But when Morrison showed her David's photographs and Lydia's documentation, her expression shifted from skepticism to alarm. If even a tenth of this is accurate, we're looking at the largest conspiracy case in New England history, Moss said, studying the organizational charts. But I need more than photographs and allegations. I need witnesses who will testify under oath. Marcus Thornfield has already confessed on record. Lydia Thornfield has 30 years of documentation. Rebecca Walsh has been investigating the missing persons cases independently. And where is Ms. Walsh now? Morrison checked his watch. We're supposed to meet her in 2 hours. But I think the conspiracy has already gotten to her editors. Moss made several phone calls, speaking in the careful language of someone navigating political minefields. When she hung up, her expression was grim. I can get you a federal marshal for protection, but it will take hours to arrange. If this ceremony is happening tonight, we may not have enough time to prevent it. Then we prevent it ourselves, Chen said firmly. We go back to Millbrook and we stop Michael Graves from killing anyone else. Morrison stared at her. Sarah, that's exactly what he wants. He's counting on you showing up so he can complete his ritual. Then we give him what he wants, but on our terms." Chen pulled out her phone and showed them a map of the Thornfield property. "The ritual site is in the woods behind the house, right? The same clearing where we found all the bodies." "According to Lydia's information, yes. Then we know the terrain. We know the layout, and we have one advantage Michael doesn't expect." Chen looked at Morrison. "We have someone who's been studying this case for 37 years. Someone who understands the family's methods better than anyone except the killers themselves." Moss leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We go to the meeting with Rebecca Walsh, but we're prepared for it to be a trap. If Michael has taken her, we follow him back to the ritual site and we document everything. Get enough evidence on video to prove the conspiracy exists, even if we don't survive to testify about it." Morrison felt the familiar weight of a case that had consumed his entire career. "Sarah, you're talking about using yourself as bait. I'm talking about doing what Sarah Thornfield tried to do in 1987, expose the truth no matter what it costs." Chen's voice carried the determination of someone who'd finally found a cause worth dying for. "Ray, how many more people have to disappear before someone stops this family?" Morrison thought about David Chen, about Sarah Thornfield, about all the victims whose names they'd found in Lydia's files. "All right. But we do this smart. We go in wired for sound and video. We have backup positioned where they can respond quickly. And the first sign that things are going wrong, we abort." Moss was already making arrangements for surveillance equipment and tactical support. "I can have a team ready in 3 hours. But Detective Chen, you understand that once you're inside that ritual circle, there may be nothing we can do to help you." Chen nodded. "I understand. But someone has to be willing to take the risk. Someone has to finally give these victims justice." Morrison looked at the young detective, who reminded him so much of his younger self, brave, determined, and perhaps foolishly optimistic about the power of truth to overcome evil. "Then let's go finish what Sarah started," he said. The meeting place Rebecca Walsh had chosen was an abandoned warehouse in the industrial section of Cambridge, the kind of location that screamed trap to anyone with Morrison's experience. But as they approached the building at sunset, Chen insisted on going through with the plan, despite every instinct telling them to run. "Remember, the wire is voice-activated," Moss's technical specialist had explained during their briefing. "It will record everything within a 50-foot radius, and the signal goes directly to our monitoring station. If things go wrong, help will be there in under 10 minutes. 10 minutes felt like an eternity to Morrison as they walked through the warehouse entrance. The building had been gutted years ago, leaving only concrete floors and skeletal steel beams that stretched up into darkness. Their footsteps echoed in the empty space, announcing their presence to anyone waiting in the shadows. Rebecca Walsh stood in the center of the warehouse floor, but something was wrong with her posture, her expression. As they got closer, Morrison could see that her hands were zip-tied behind her back and her mouth was covered with duct tape. Her eyes were wide with terror and warning. "Detective Chen," a voice called from the darkness above them. "Thank you for coming. I was beginning to think you'd lost your courage." Michael Graves stepped out from behind a support pillar, dressed in the same ceremonial robes they'd seen in David's photographs. But in person, the FBI agent carried an authority that made Morrison's skin crawl. The confidence of someone who'd killed dozens of people and never faced consequences. "Agent Graves," Chen called back, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Let Ms. Walsh go. Your quarrel is with me. My quarrel is with anyone who threatens the family's sacred work." Graves descended a set of metal stairs, his footsteps ringing against the steel. "You've been very busy, Detective Chen, digging up old graves, asking uncomfortable questions, spreading lies about ancient traditions you couldn't possibly understand." Morrison positioned himself slightly behind Chen, his hand moving slowly toward the service weapon he still carried despite his retirement. "What tradition justifies murdering innocent people?" "Innocent?" Graves laughed, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls. Sarah Thornfield was going to destroy something that had taken generations to build. David Chen was spreading poison about practices that maintain the balance between life and death. These people chose to be obstacles to forces beyond their comprehension. They chose to expose serial killers hiding behind religious nonsense. Graves' expression hardened. "Detective Morrison, you've been a thorn in my family's side for 37 years. Sarah called your name as she died. Did you know that? She believed you would come for her, that you would understand the truth. But you failed her then, just as you're failing Detective Chen now. The psychological warfare was deliberate, Morrison knew. Graves wanted them angry, wanted them to make mistakes. But Chen stepped forward before Morrison could respond. Sarah didn't fail, she said firmly. She left evidence that led us to you. David didn't fail. His research exposed your entire network. And we haven't failed either. Right now, Assistant Attorney General Patricia Moss has everything we've discovered. If we don't walk out of here alive, the story goes public anyway. Graves smiled, and Morrison saw genuine amusement in his expression. Patricia Moss has been a family friend for 15 years, Detective Chen. Did you really think we hadn't prepared for every contingency? The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. The conspiracy reached even deeper than they'd imagined, extending into the very prosecutor's office they'd trusted with their evidence. The ritual will proceed as planned, Graves continued. Your life force will join the family essence, just as Sarah's did, just as David's did. Your deaths will strengthen us for another generation. Over my dead body, Morrison said, drawing his weapon. That can certainly be arranged, Graves gestured. And figures emerged from the shadows around the warehouse. At least 6 people in ceremonial robes, all carrying weapons that looked both ancient and deadly. Chen drew her service pistol, backing against Morrison so they stood together facing the circle of killers. Ray, the wire is still broadcasting. Even if we don't make it out, at least there will be evidence that Patricia Moss will conveniently lose or declare inadmissible. But Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. The clarity that came with finally understanding the true scope of what they were fighting. Graves raised his hand, and Morrison could see the ritual scars that marked him as a true believer in his family's twisted faith. The autumn equinox waits for no one, Detective Chen. It's time to join your ancestors in the eternal binding. The warehouse lights went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the flickering flames of candles that the robed figures had somehow lit without Morrison noticing. In that moment, he realized they weren't just fighting Michael Graves. They were fighting a conspiracy that had spent over a century perfecting the art of ritual murder. But for the first time since 1987, Morrison felt like he finally understood what Sarah Thornfield had been trying to tell him. Sometimes the only way to expose evil was to face it directly, regardless of the cost. The candle flames cast dancing shadows on the warehouse walls as Morrison and Chen found themselves surrounded by figures that seemed to have stepped out of a medieval nightmare. The robed killers moved with practiced coordination, forming a ritual circle that had been performed countless times before. You know, Detective Morrison, Graves said, his voice carrying an almost conversational tone. Sarah left you a message that night, something she whispered just before the binding was complete. Morrison kept his weapon trained on Graves, but he could feel the other figures closing in from all sides. What message? She said to tell you that the truth was hidden where the family tree grows deepest. We never understood what she meant until we found David Chen's research in the carriage house. Graves smiled. She was trying to tell you about the genealogical records that would expose our entire network. Chen shifted beside Morrison, and he could feel her tension like electricity in the air. The records we already found. The ones that prove you're Edmund Thornfield's son. Those records, yes. But also the ones that show how many law enforcement families have intermarried with our bloodline over the past century. How many judges and prosecutors and police chiefs carry our genetic legacy? Graves gestured to the robed figures around them. Detective Chen, You're looking at representatives of 17 families who have maintained the old traditions in America for over 100 years. Morrison felt pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place. That's how you've covered up the murders for so long. It's not just corruption, it's a genetic network spread throughout the justice system. Blood calls to blood, Detective Morrison. When one of our children goes into law enforcement, they carry with them the responsibility to protect the family work. One of the robed figures stepped forward, lowering her hood to reveal Dr. Patricia Wells. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized how completely they'd been manipulated. "All those forensic reports," he said. "All that evidence you analyzed for us. I told you exactly what you needed to hear to keep the investigation focused in safe directions," Wells replied. "The bodies we excavated, the artifacts we catalogued, all carefully, selected to tell a story that would satisfy your need for justice while protecting the deeper truth." Chen raised her weapon toward Wells. "How many of the burial sites did you destroy before we could examine them?" "Enough. The most recent graves, the ones that would have provided DNA evidence linking to people still alive, were quietly relocated during the first night of excavation." Morrison realized they'd been dancing to the conspiracy's tune from the moment the construction workers had found the hidden room. "You wanted us to discover the evidence. You wanted us to think we were solving the case. We needed to identify everyone who might pose a threat to our operations," Graves confirmed. "Your investigation served as an excellent way to flush out potential problems. David Chen's cousin, for instance. Marcus Thornfield's confessions. Lydia's hidden documentation. What did you do to Lydia?" "Ms. Thornfield met with an unfortunate accident 2 hours after you left Oregon. Apparently, she fell down the stairs in her apartment building. Very tragic." Chen's face went pale. "You killed her. We eliminated a threat to the family's security. Just as we're about to eliminate you." Graves moved closer, and Morrison could see the ritual knife in his hand, the same blade that had been used to murder Sarah Thornfield 37 years ago. "The autumn equinox requires a sacrifice of particular significance," Graves continued. "Someone whose death will send a message to anyone else who might consider investigating our activities." Morrison calculated their options. 6 robed figures, armed with weapons both modern and ancient. Rebecca Walsh tied up and helpless in the center of the circle. No backup coming, because the people they'd trusted were part of the conspiracy. But then he heard something that gave him hope. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Graves heard them too, his expression shifting from confident control to sudden concern. "That's impossible. We control all the local emergency services." "Local, yes," Chen said with grim satisfaction. "But not federal. Not the real federal agents, the ones who aren't part of your family network." The warehouse doors burst open as tactical teams flooded in, their flashlights cutting through the candle-lit darkness like searchlights. Commands to drop weapons echoed off the concrete walls as the ritual circle dissolved into chaos. Morrison grabbed Chen's arm, pulling her toward the ground as gunfire erupted around them. In the confusion, he saw Graves trying to reach Rebecca Walsh with his ritual knife, apparently determined to complete at least part of his ceremony even if the larger plan had failed. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The voice belonged to someone Morrison didn't recognize, someone whose authority cut through the supernatural atmosphere that Graves had been building. As the tactical lights illuminated the warehouse, Morrison could see that the robed figures were just people, frightened, desperate people who'd built their lives around a lie that was finally collapsing. But Graves himself fought like someone who had nothing left to lose, using the ritual knife with the skill of someone who'd killed many times before. Morrison watched him cut down 2 federal agents before disappearing into the maze of support pillars and machinery that filled the warehouse's upper levels. "He's getting away," Chen shouted over the gunfire. Morrison looked at the chaos around them, at Rebecca Walsh being freed by paramedics, at the robed conspirators being arrested one by one. After 37 years, the truth about Sarah Thornfield's murder was finally coming to light. But Michael Graves, the man who'd orchestrated decades of ritual murder, was escaping into the darkness once again. 6 months later, Morrison stood in the cemetery where Sarah Thornfield had been buried under her real name for the first time. The simple granite headstone read, Sarah Elizabeth Thornfield, 1967-1987. Her truth finally told. Beside her grave was a new marker for David Chen, whose remains had been recovered from the woods and given the proper burial his family had never been able to provide. The trials had dominated headlines for months. 17 members of the conspiracy had been convicted on charges ranging from murder to obstruction of justice. Dr. Patricia Wells received life without parole for her role in covering up dozens of murders. Judge Morrison's son Kevin received 25 years for his participation in the ritual killings. Assistant Attorney General Patricia Moss was still fighting extradition from Brazil, where she'd fled when the conspiracy began to unravel, but Michael Graves remained at large. Chen approached through the cemetery paths, carrying a folder thick with updates from the ongoing federal investigation. At 32, she looked older than her years, marked by the weight of everything they'd uncovered about the depth of corruption in their own profession. Any new leads on Graves? Morrison asked. Nothing solid. The FBI thinks he might have fled to Europe, possibly to connect with related occult networks there. Chen sat on the bench beside Sarah's grave. But Ray, we found something else. Something that changes how we understand the whole case. She opened the folder to reveal photocopies of documents that looked far older than anything they'd discovered before. These came from a raid on a storage facility in New Hampshire, property rented by Edmund Thornfield in the 1980s. Morrison examined the papers, genealogical records that went back not decades but centuries, tracing bloodlines across multiple continents. What am I looking at? The real family history. The Thornfields weren't just one American family practicing ritual murder. They were part of something that goes back to medieval Europe, a network of families who brought their traditions to the New World and spent generations establishing themselves in positions of power. The implications made Morrison's head spin. How many families? How many countries? The documents suggest active networks in at least 6 countries, with family lines that have been intermarrying and supporting each other for over 500 years. Chen pointed to a section that had been marked with red ink. But Sarah wasn't just killed because she threatened to expose the American branch. She was killed because she discovered communications with the European families. Morrison felt a chill as he understood what Chen was telling him. She found proof of an international conspiracy, letters between Edmund Thornfield and family representatives in England, Germany, and France. Discussions about coordinating ritual calendars, sharing information about threats to their operations, even arranging marriages between bloodlines to strengthen their genetic legacy. And now Michael Graves has access to all of that. Chen nodded grimly. The European families have resources and connections that make the American conspiracy look small by comparison. Graves isn't just hiding, he's probably being welcomed into a support network that's had centuries to perfect the art of staying hidden. Morrison stared at Sarah's headstone, thinking about the young woman who died trying to expose what she'd thought was her family's isolated madness. She had no idea how big this really was. None of us did. The Federal Task Force estimates that we've only scratched the surface of the network's activities. There could be hundreds of victims we'll never identify, murders in dozens of countries that have been covered up for generations. But we exposed them. We broke their control over local law enforcement in Vermont, in Massachusetts, in a handful of other states where we had enough evidence to make arrests. Chen's expression was troubled. But Ray, they've had 500 years to establish themselves. What we uncovered was probably just one small branch of something much larger. Morrison felt the familiar weight of a case that would never truly be closed. So what do we do now? We keep investigating. The Federal Task Force wants me to transfer to their International Crimes Division. They're building cases against the European networks, using the evidence we found to trace connections across multiple countries. And they want an old retired detective to consult on cases involving medieval murder cults. Chen smiled for the first time in months. They want the detective who spent 37 years refusing to give up on Sarah Thornfield's case. The one who proved that sometimes the truth is worth waiting for. Morrison looked out across the cemetery, where afternoon sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees onto graves that held secrets of their own. Somewhere out there, Michael Graves was planning new murders, new rituals, new ways to feed the hunger that had consumed his family for generations. But for the first time since 1987, Morrison felt like the truth was finally stronger than the conspiracy that had tried to bury it. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go catch some more killers." As they walked away from Sarah's grave, Morrison could almost hear her voice carried on the wind, not the terrified whisper of her final recording, but the determined voice of a young woman who decided to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume everything she loved. Her truth had finally been told. Now it was time to tell the truth about all the others.